respecting that rule. Now on to the business of the day. It's been 655 days since Hamas's murderous and barbaric attacks on the people of Israel that changed the Middle East in irreversible ways. When Dean and I visited Israel in the weeks after October 7th, the moral depravity of that day and Hamas's intent to ignite Iran's ring of fire determined to destroy Israel and destabilize the region, those goals were very clear. Instead, those dastardly attacks set in motion a chain of events culminating in a strategic blow to Hamas's patron, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and unleashed seismic shifts in the geopolitical landscape unseen in recent memory and which provide enormous opportunity. Israel's brilliant campaign against Hezbollah in August and September of 24 neutralized their senior leadership and destroyed its terror infrastructure, weapons depots, including over 100 anti-aircraft batteries and tens of thousands of missiles and rockets that were aimed at Israeli civilians. In December of 2024, Iran and Russia's longtime crony in Syria, Bashar al-Assad, abandoned the country and the regime collapsed like a house of cards. These events, combined with Israel's successful air campaigns against Iran's air defense systems in the fall and the spring of 2024, they set the stage for one of the most dramatic events to date, Operation Rising Lion and Operation Midnight Hammer. In Operation Rising Lion, Israel preemptively struck dozens of targets across Iran, neutralizing their nuclear infrastructure, military command, control sites, ballistic missile production, launch, and storage sites, as well as target assassinations of top political, nuclear, and military officials. And this conduct was an unparalleled success, with Israel destroying over 40 years of Iranians' military buildup, and set the stage for Operation Midnight Hammer, where President Trump executed a decisive and devastating blow, led by brave American warfighters against 3 of Iran's key nuclear facilities. These strikes secured regional safety, upheld the non-proliferation regime, and reshaped the regional balance of power. Soleimani's so-called Ring of Fire, a network of terrorist proxies and militant groups in Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Gaza, and Iran, designed to pressure and deter Israel and the United States, turned out to be little more than a flicker of a match. And far from retreating from the region, the success of Midnight Hammer is a case study for how a capable U.S. ally can defend itself in tandem with a credible deterrent from the United States. The strategic implications of this should not be lost on us or adversaries who continue to wage wars of aggression in Ukraine or who seek to sow instability in the Indo-Pacific. Today, because of U.S. and Israel's joint operations during the 12-day war, Iran has suffered an historic and humiliating strategic and tactical defeat. The regime is at its weakest point, politically and militarily, since the revolution of 1979, and Israel is in its strongest position since its sweeping victory in the Six-Day War. Despite our successes, we know, however, this fight is not over. Last week, Tehran's Houthi allies in Yemen struck 2 commercial ships traveling in the Red Sea. Iran's proxy militias in Iraq remain a threat and are suspected of disrupting oil production in Kurdistan. Instability reigns in Syria as the new regime struggles to show they are willing or able to protect Druze, Christian, and other minority groups. And just this week, an American citizen from Oklahoma and members of his family were brutally gunned down in the street. I agree with my friend, U.S. envoy to Syria, Tom Barrack. Al-Shara risks squandering the moment and will have to adapt quickly if he expects U.S. support. While we know the new government in Beirut is making good faith efforts to disarm Hezbollah, we also know that Iran is dead set on reconstituting Hezbollah's capabilities in Lebanon, especially through the shipment of rockets. And perhaps most significantly, Iran seems unwilling to take up President Trump's generous offers of direct nuclear talks. And Hamas continues to hold 50 hostages in Gaza, including 2 Americans. And so the challenge going forward is how to translate these dramatic military achievements into diplomatic, economic, and political peace that will benefit the United States, our regional allies, and our partners. And I know that Senator Rosen and my colleagues that will come today share my interest in building on the success of the Abraham Accords, which I know you, Mr. Hook, were involved in, to strengthen the relationships between the United States, Israel, and the Arab partners. I was just on a code out to Israel and the UAE in May, and it's clear that our partners in the region share President Trump's vision of forging, and we overlap there in Israel, forging a future where the Middle East is defined by commerce, not chaos, cooperation, not conflict. Now, to help us navigate these complex issues today, we have an incredible panel of former U.S. officials and expert practitioners, and we are truly looking forward to your insights and recommendations. I am so happy to recognize the ranking member and my friend, Senator Rosen, for her opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Chair McCormick, for holding today's important hearings. And like you said, this is the subcommittee's first since you and I were named chair and ranking member, respectively. I am really excited about the work we're going to be able to do together to support U.S. interests across a broad swath of the globe, from the Middle East to North Africa to Central and South Asia. And I want to thank you. I will send a thank you as well to our witnesses for taking the time to offer your insights today. And now I'd like to build upon your remarks, Senator McCormick, because as you illustrated, the Middle East is at a critical juncture. It's full of risks as well as opportunities. How we engage in the region in the coming weeks and months has a potential to alter its trajectory for decades to come. In just the last few weeks, we've seen hostilities between Israel and Iran. We've seen increased Houthi attacks on maritime commerce in the Red Sea, skirmishes between Israel and Syria, and a lack of progress of ending the war in Gaza, bringing home all of the hostages held by Hamas home and addressing the humanitarian crisis. But since the beginning of the year, we've also seen the decline of Iran's nuclear and ballistic capabilities, Assad's regime beginning to crumble in Syria, Hezbollah be diminished to a shell of its former self in Lebanon, and the significant weakening of Hamas. To help set the Middle East on a path towards peace and prosperity, we not only have to deter our adversaries from engaging in harmful actions, we must also work to advance our interests by implementing a coherent strategy and assistance plan for the region. So I'm going to be clear. Iran can never be allowed to acquire or develop a nuclear weapon. I couldn't be more clear than that. And I'm hopeful that our targeted strikes on Iran's nuclear program earlier this summer will pave the way to a negotiated agreement that makes this a reality. But it is critical the administration works hand in glove with Congress on what comes next. We must also ensure that terror groups, especially Iranian proxies, cannot operate freely and threaten stability in the Middle East. And so to that end, I've led bipartisan efforts to freeze Iranian assets, tighten and renew sanctions, and integrate air and missile defenses throughout the region. But we must do more to bolster regional stability and deny extremist groups the instability frankly, on which they thrive. An integrated Middle East of like-minded partners and allies is essential to advancing our interests, which is why we must widen and deepen the Abraham Accords, including through economic integration and other people-to-people bonds that provide tangible benefits to the region. In Gaza, Hamas remains an impediment to peace and poses a threat to both Israelis and Palestinians. We must continue to support Israel as it works to free the hostages, defeat Hamas, and protect itself against future threats. And at the same time, we must also allow for more humanitarian aid for civilians in Gaza and do everything possible to prevent the loss of innocent lives and support a negotiated end to the war. In Syria and Iraq, we cannot cede ground where the U.S.-led coalition has made significant progress in eliminating the ISIS threat. To consolidate our military gains, we need to ensure that terrorists are held accountable for their horrific crimes. We must also make sure that there is a thoughtful plan for reintegration and rehabilitation of individuals from Al-Hol and Al-Roj camps. If we fail to reintegrate these populations, it will be at our peril. This leads me to my last point. Former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis once said, "If you don't fully fund the State Department, then I'll need to buy more ammunition." Diplomacy and foreign assistance is vital to the future of this region. When people don't have access to food or jobs, terror groups recruit them. When children don't have access to education, they're more easily radicalized. And as this administration slashes our diplomatic corps, expert civil servants, and foreign assistance programs, we are undeniably less safe and less prosperous. So to set the region on the right path, we can't be afraid to leverage our military strength, but we must certainly also leverage our diplomatic and foreign assistance tools. I thank you again for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to discussing this with all of you today.
Very good. Thank you, Senator Rosen. Thanks for organizing this hearing with me today. Let me introduce our witnesses. We have an all-star panel, and I really mean it. We have terrific expertise and experience at this table, so thank you all for coming. Let me start with Mr. Brian Hook, who has served as a key diplomat and senior advisor to the Department of States under President George H.W. Bush, President George W. Bush, and President Donald J. Trump. During the Trump administration, he served as director of the State Department's policy planning staff and a U.S. Special Representative for Iran, where he was the lead architect of the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. Brian's also a key official in the team that negotiated peace agreements known collectively as the Abraham Accords. He also held a number of senior positions in the Bush administration, including Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations, Senior Advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, and Special Assistant to the President for Policy. It's nice to have an old friend back before the committee. Thank you, Brian. Great to see you. We also have Ambassador Dan Shapiro, a distinguished diplomat, foreign policy expert with over 2 decades of experience in senior U.S. government positions. Ambassador Shapiro served as President Biden's top Middle East policy official at the Pentagon as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. He also served as the Department of State's Senior Advisor for Regional Integration in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs and as Senior Advisor to the Special Envoy for Iran. He is also notably the former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, having served in that role from 2011 to 2017. He's had a number of senior roles at the National Security Council and here on Capitol Hill. In addition to his incredible government service, Shapiro was a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council, a distinguished visiting fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. Ambassador Shapiro, thank you for being here and welcome back. And last but certainly not least, from the great city of Pittsburgh, Ms. Shelley Culbertson, who is also a neighbor in Squirrel Hill, senior policy researcher at RAND, a nonpartisan research institution. Ms. Culbertson's research focuses on disaster and post-conflict recovery, refugees, and international development. Her international development work has focused on the Middle East, including in Iraq, where she led a study on post-conflict stabilization in Mosul, Iraq, after coalition operations against ISIS. She previously served in the RAND Homeland Security Research Division Management Team as Associate Director of the Disaster Management Resilience Program, also Director of the Infrastructure, Immigration, and Security Operations Program. So welcome, Shelley. Thank you for being here. I'd like to remind our witnesses to try to keep your opening remarks to 5 minutes. Your submitted testimony will be entered in full, and we're looking forward to a great discussion. Mr. Hook, you are now recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to be with you, an old friend, and to Ranking Member Rosen, good to be with you as well. I very much enjoyed your opening statements, which I thought nicely captured the risks and the opportunity that we have before us. I believe that the old order in the Middle East is passing away and a new, better order is coming into view. We have too much proof of a better order to return to the failed strategies that perpetuated the old order. American diplomacy should support the new and dynamic Middle East, which is the subject of today's hearing. In broad strokes, I think this means diplomacy that stands by our allies in good times and in bad. It means deterring our adversaries, and it means sustaining the incredible gains made over the last 2 years, especially during the recent 12-day war against the Iranian regime. I have never been more optimistic about the future of the Middle East than I am now. In the aftermath of October 7th, Iran's imperial expansionist project has come undone. The US and Israel are systematically dismantling the architecture of Iran's malign influence. We are no longer managing the nuclear threat, we are resolving it. Unprecedented joint actions against Iran's nuclear facilities, as well as its nuclear program, its missile program and its proxies have changed the balance of power in the region. If we continue the current strategy of deterrence and diplomacy, a new and better Middle East will follow. The United States can help midwife a regional dynamic of sovereign states anchored by Israel and Arab Gulf nations, who together counter extremism, invest in their own citizens, and recognize the right of the Jewish people to live in peace alongside their neighbors. President Trump described this vision in his 2017 Riyadh speech. He deserves great credit for realizing this vision across his first term and into the second term. He recognizes that peace is helped by maintaining escalation dominance, and diplomacy is helped by focusing on common interests with our allies. We should help organize our allies around shared interests. For example, countering Iran's threats to the US and the region, advancing the peace process through the Abraham Accords, and deepening economic and cultural ties. But continued success in the region is not inevitable. American leadership, coupled with burden sharing by our partners, is essential for this vision to become a reality. We should convert the military gains, the recent military gains, into an enduring balance of power that favors America and her regional allies. The US and its partners should continue resisting Iran's expansionist, anti-Semitic designs in the region. We must ensure that Iran's proxy Hamas is uprooted from Gaza. I very much hope that this can be conducted by Israel in a way to maintain support here in the United States, and that Israel will continue to ensure the safe delivery of humanitarian assistance to the Gazans who are suffering under Hamas control. We should ensure that Hezbollah remains degraded in Lebanon. The United States should continue enforcing oil sanctions against Iran, including by implementing the SHIP Act, which I encouraged Congress to pass last year when I testified before this committee. Easing pressure now would allow Iran's oil revenue to fund terrorism and finance the reconstitution of its nuclear program. I want to close by noting that the combined efforts of the United States and Israel against the Iranian regime have deeply weakened an engine of anti-Semitism in the region. Regrettably, this evil is not confined to the Middle East. We hear echoes here at home of the anti-Semitism that animates Iran's regime. It is on college campuses, in online echo chambers, and increasingly in mainstream discourse. It was seen tragically in Pittsburgh in 2018 at the Tree of Life Synagogue, blocks from the home of Senator McCormick. Those who traffic in anti-Semitism often present themselves as bold or provocative contrarians, but they perpetuate an ancient hatred. In every form anti-Semitism takes and in every place it emerges, we must continue to confront it with moral clarity and principled opposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hook. And Ambassador.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Rosen, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thanks for the opportunity to testify at this very timely hearing. We are, as you both have stated and Mr. Hook did, at a critical moment for U.S. policy in the Middle East because we do have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to help reshape the region in ways that will bring more peace and prosperity and less conflict and violence to those who live there and significant benefit to the interests of the United States. In my opening remarks, I'll make 3 points about the opportunities and risks we face. First, since Hamas launched this war in the vicious terrorist attacks of October 7th, a combination, as you've both noted, of Israeli and U.S. military power has dealt blow after blow to the Iranian-aligned axis of resistance. Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis in Yemen, Shia militia groups in Iraq and Syria, and ultimately Iran itself. And along the way, Iran's regional partner, the Assad regime, crumbled. All told, Iran, owing to its own miscalculations and aggression, is at its weakest point in decades. President Trump was right to seek a nuclear deal with Iran through diplomacy, but given how close Iran was to a nuclear weapon and its proven willingness to attack Israel directly, I believe a military confrontation was necessary and inevitable. Israeli and U.S. operations caused severe damage to Iran's nuclear facilities. They'll be unusable for a significant period of time, and that's time we can perhaps extend through a range of means. Now, none of this means the threats posed by Iran and its proxies are eliminated, but the significant gains produced by military power now give us the opportunity to use all the tools at our disposal, deterrence, but also diplomacy, to consolidate those gains. Second, we must now prioritize diplomatic tools to advance our regional objectives. In my full statement, I describe a range of initiatives in 3 categories. I'll briefly summarize them. Category 1 is developing a comprehensive day-after plan for Gaza that includes the release of all hostages, protection of Israel's security, removal of Hamas from power, relief for Palestinian civilians, and a regionally supported reconstruction for Palestinians who want to live in peace with Israel. This work includes enabling a vastly improved mechanism to provide humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Hamas bears much responsibility for the hunger crisis in Gaza by hijacking aid for its own benefit. But the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation alternative is also vastly insufficient, and it's flawed and dangerous in its design, which has led to far too many deaths. The day after plan should also include exile of remaining Hamas leaders and fighters from Gaza, an interim security mission for Gaza from Arab states with U.S. support, improved leadership of the Palestinian Authority, new leadership in Gaza linked to the PA and supported by Arab states such as the UAE and Saudi Arabia, articulation of a pathway to a future Palestinian state, and opposition to Israeli moves toward annexation in the West Bank. Category 2 is continuing and expanding the regional integration process launched by the Abraham Accords, one of the great events of recent Middle East history. This includes prioritizing discussions with Saudi Arabia on the timing, conditions, and mechanism of normalization with Israel, including the bilateral U.S.-Saudi agreements that can undergird it. Saudi officials have consistently said they also require a clear pathway to the establishment of a Palestinian state. But this work also includes reconvening and expanding the Negev Forum as soon as possible after the war, appointing and confirming a special envoy for the Abraham Accords, and working toward a non-belligerency agreement between Israel and Syria. Category 3 is capitalizing on the damage to Iran's nuclear program and the weakening of the Iranian-led access to secure a long-term improvement in the regional security environment. That means seeking renewed negotiations with Iran to sustain the gains of the military strikes, prevent the nuclear program's reconstitution, secure full access for IAEA inspectors, locate and remove Iran's enriched uranium stockpile, assure zero enrichment going forward, and achieve meaningful limits on Iran's ballistic missile inventory. It also means maintaining pressure on Iran by coordinating with European partners on the snapback of JCPOA sanctions, increasing efforts to scale back Iranian oil exports to China, and making clear that additional military strikes by Israel or the United States are possible. We must also prepare for the possibility of internally driven regime change, not as U.S. policy, but as something the Iranian people take into their own hands. But we should be providing appropriate support to the Iranian people now and develop a plan to support a transition so we're not caught flat-footed if the Iranian people do take matters into their own hands. Finally, I'll just flag 2 areas that cause me concern that could cause us to miss this opportunity. First, none of our goals for expanding regional integration can really get off the ground until the Gaza war ends. A 60-day ceasefire would bring much-needed relief, but it really must transition directly into the end of the war. That will require Israeli agreement to certain terms, but also intense pressure on Hamas by Qatar and other actors. If we miss this opening to end the war, the risk is that we'll slide into the only alternative, a full-scale Israeli occupation of Gaza, something the IDF has consistently told us they do not want to do. That will mean more dead hostages, more dead Palestinian civilians, more dead Israeli soldiers, no positive involvement by Arab states in Gaza's future, and deepening isolation of Israel. President Trump can help by withdrawing his Gaza Riviera proposal, which has emboldened some of the most extreme members of the Israeli cabinet to press for full-scale occupation, and I hope he would do that. That idea is widely rejected in the region, and it will discourage Arab states from helping stabilize Gaza. Second, the Trump administration is also dismantling, as Senator Rosen mentioned, critical capabilities that we need to advance U.S. interests in the region. Right after the war with Iran, the State Department imposed drastic cuts to personnel, including experts in nuclear diplomacy, sanctions enforcement, counterterrorism, post-conflict transitions, and Israeli-Palestinian relations. Just when we need to help stabilize Syria and Lebanon, The elimination of USAID means we don't have functional and adequately resourced foreign assistance programs that can help. And just when we need to counter the propaganda the Iranian regime feeds to its population, we've decimated our international broadcasting capabilities so they don't hear from us. And meanwhile, China is deepening its activity and influence in all these areas everywhere the United States pulls back. I feel that's a serious own goal, and it's going to harm our ability to seize these opportunities in this dynamic Middle East. I hope it'll be reversed. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador. And Ms. Culberson, I'll turn to you for your opening statement, and then Senator Kane, we're going to be here for the whole hearing, so I know so we'll turn to you for questions as soon as we finish with this opening statement.
Man, nobody ever lets me jump to the head of the line. It's the first time
Well, we
in
haven't heard
13
your
years here.
We haven't heard your questions yet. Thank you. Thank you. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Chairman McCormick, Ranking Member Rosen, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today. I'm a senior policy researcher at RAND, a nonpartisan research organization. We meet at a pivotal moment for the Middle East and for the role of the United States in shaping its future. Operation Midnight Hammer and the military activities leading up to it have set back Iran's nuclear capabilities and weakened its proxies. Hamas has lost capacity and credibility. Hezbollah is diminished, opening the way for the Lebanese state to reassert authority. In Syria, the United States lifted sanctions on the new government to enable recovery. Iraq is preparing for elections that could further erode Iranian influence. The common thread, Iran's ability to project disruptive power across the region, is waning. But Iran is down, not out. We now face a strategic opportunity to set a new course for the Middle East. This opportunity cannot be secured by military means alone. It requires a renewed approach grounded in diplomacy, economic facilitation, humanitarian leadership, and strategic investment. The United States can reestablish itself as the partner of choice, as the country that helps people in the region solve problems and realize their aspiration for security, prosperity, and even normalcy, instead of Iran, Russia, China, or extremist groups. It is in U.S. interest to do so. This means rethinking what constitutes U.S. interests. Civilian displacement, state collapse, and economic despair are not peripheral. They're central to long-term global stability. These are, of course, primarily the responsibility of regional governments, but the United States has powerful tools to support progress. Doing so is not charity, it's strategy. The US has repeatedly sought to reduce its footprint in the Middle East, only to be drawn back in again and again. Every administration since Jimmy Carter has launched new military operations there in response to threats to American interests. This has meant chasing symptoms instead of solving underlying problems. We now have an opportunity to break that cycle. Here are 5 steps the United States could take. First, mediate the ends of conflicts. In Gaza, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Libya, conflicts continue to destabilize the region, fuel humanitarian crises, and create vacuums for malign actors. US diplomacy has already shown promise, including through the Abraham Accords. We can build on this by helping to end the war in Gaza, brokering Saudi-Israeli normalization with meaningful provisions for Palestinians, and mediating local disputes in Syria, as we once did successfully in northern Iraq. Second, address long-term humanitarian crises. The Middle East has over 24 million displaced people, many with no realistic path to return home, integrate, or resettle. Displacement on this scale is not just a humanitarian concern, it's a driver of instability. Global refugee systems are broken. New solutions, especially for the 6 million refugees, won't materialize without US leadership. Third, support post-war recovery. To prevent the return of violence, conflict-affected regions need visible, sustained progress: jobs, schools, hospitals, justice systems, and functioning markets. Recovery won't happen fast enough without targeted support. The Marshall Plan succeeded not just because of money, but because it coordinated conditions to restore trade, public finances, and private investment. Fourth, help improve governance and create jobs. High youth unemployment and poor governance were major drivers of the Arab Spring and remain sources of unrest. These are not just internal challenges, they're regional risks. U.S. support for better policing, public services, vocational training, and economic reforms can reduce the appeal of extremism and show that we are a partner in progress. Fifth, focus on strategic priority locations. Iraq, Syria, the West Bank and Gaza, and Lebanon each face serious challenges, but each could become a model of recovery and partnership. A focused effort across them, anchored in civilian tools, can prevent return to war and reinforce U.S. leadership. None of this requires the U.S. to act alone or bear every cost, but we can lead where others cannot. We can align incentives and coordinate allies, multilateral institutions, regional partners, and the private sector. Let me close with two futures. In the first, conflicts grind on, economies remain stagnant, Iran, Russia, and China fill the vacuum, extremist groups like Hamas and ISIS exploit social gaps, refugees flee, and the United States is pulled back in again and again. In the second, the United States steps forward with strategic leadership. We help end wars, we support government in rebuilding, cities recover, youth find work, the region stabilizes, and draws closer to us and our allies. We can choose, at least in part, which future unfolds. We have willing partners. While recovery is the region's responsibility, it's in our own national interest to stand with them. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Culberson. And Senator Kane?
Thank you for hosting this hearing. It's really important. And I think I'll hopscotch around a little bit because there's so many different topics. I think it's at the end of this week, maybe the day after tomorrow, that France, Germany, and Britain are going to meet with Iran and Turkey to talk about the imposition of snapback sanctions under the JCPOA for Iran's bad activity. I view that as a positive that these three European nations are considering the imposition of snapback sanctions. Would you generally agree with that?
Senator, I do agree. I think it's very important that leverage be used to try to move Iran in the direction we need them to go, which is to relinquish their highly enriched uranium and their any residual enrichment capability. I believe those meetings are coordinated between the Europeans and Secretary Rubio, as they really need to be, because the Europeans are the ones who hold that key, and that needs to be a partnership.
And again, we don't know the outcome of these, so the proof's in the pudding. But do Ms. Culbertson, Mr. Hook, do you generally agree these allies trying to use the tools of the JCPOA, the snapback sanctions, could be effective leverage?
Yeah, I supported snapback in 2019, 2020, because we believed that Iran was in sufficient breach of its nuclear obligations that it justified triggering snapback sanctions. The E3 were not with us then. I am very heartened to see them with us now. I think that...
Had we already pulled out of the JCPOA in 2019?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was a little bit hard to convince them to, use the JCPOA when we had backed away from the table, but it is, and I agree with you, it would have been better had they done it earlier, but at least it is a tool. So we'll cross our fingers that maybe
Agreed.
The discussions might be helpful. A couple of you just mentioned, but really didn't give us a report on Iraq. What's going on in Iraq right now? So as Iranian influence is weakened with Syria, the Hezbollah being weakened, the Houthis they're sort of weakened, but sort of maybe sitting back and waiting. But what's going on in Iraq? Has the Iranian weakening weakened their hold in Iraq, or is that still something that the committee needs to pay a lot of attention to?
Iranian weakening is evident in Iraq. I think we can see this in the muted response from the Iranian-backed militias during the recent fighting between Israel and Iran. It seems that the younger generations in particular want something different in their future rather than increased fighting, and they also recognize their weaker position and inability to be as effective as that could be. And so therefore, they're becoming more and more engaged in interest in domestic affairs. Iraq's prime minister has been somewhat effective in keeping stability and starting improvements on better development of public services in the economy, and there's momentum there that merits U.S. support to continue in that direction.
please.
If I could just add, Senator, during the Biden administration, we negotiated with Iraq a 2-year transition of Operation Inherent Resolve, our counter-ISIS mission, with the ability to extend that further by mutual agreement. And so I think it's something I hope the administration will turn to, since the Iraqi Shia militias have largely been deterred from additional attacks against U.S. forces after or some early attacks in the first months of the war. I think there's a good opportunity to find a more stable basis to maintain a U.S. presence that supports the Iraqi security forces continuing the counter-ISIS mission, provides some reassurance to our Kurdish partners, and also gives us a presence, quite limited presence, but a presence that nevertheless allows us to balance Iranian influence and compete with them.
Let me ask this: with Hezbollah weakened, how important is it that the United States continue to support the Lebanese armed forces?
It's critical. The Lebanese armed forces are the state institution that has the legitimacy for maintaining the means of force, and the United States is now quite invested, first from the end of the Biden administration and into the beginning of the Trump administration, to help this new Lebanese government, the president, who's the former commander of the Lebanese armed forces, and prime minister, really build up their capabilities. But critically, it's going to have to include disarmament, complete disarmament of Hezbollah, which is not a completed process just yet.
Let me just say, as I hand it back, Mr. Hook talked about anti-Semitism at home and abroad, and it's very, very serious from whatever direction it comes. We had a hearing yesterday with the president's nominee to be ambassador to Belgium, and we didn't have huge attendance at the moment I was asking him questions, but I pointed out that he was reposting material from a Belgian far-right leader who had been convicted and imprisoned for Holocaust denial and other offenses that were sort of in the anti-Semitism space. When we get to a business committee markup on this individual, I'll present that material when all of us are around the table, because again, whether it's from the left or the right, or whether it's in this country or somewhere else in the world, we got to take it seriously. I yield back. Thank you for allowing me to jump ahead.
Thank you, Senator. So I'll do 5.
Yes,
Perfect. Well, thank you again, panel. Let me begin with a comment Secretary Rubio made before this committee. I asked him about Iran's proxies and how the administration's approach to the nuclear negotiation would be influenced by that. And he made it clear those are two separate tracks, which made sense to me at the time, not to conflate the negotiations of Iran's nuclear program with their state sponsorship of terrorism, including the Houthis and Hezbollah and the militias in Iraq and so forth. But that sort of begs the question, how important is it, in your opinion, I turn to you, Mr. Hook and Ambassador Shapiro, how important is it to maintain pressure on Iran's support of those terror proxies? How would you assess the degree of that support today in light of the recent attacks? And how do you recommend we continue to bring the Europeans and regional allies on board with this approach? Maybe we'll start with you, Brian, and then you, Ambassador.
Senator, I think it could be a very good strategy to have the nuclear talks limited to the nuclear talks while the United States, Israel, and its partners address the proxies as they have been doing over the last couple of years, essentially since October 7th, where Israel and the United States has done historic work damaging Iran's projection of power through its proxies. And when I think about Iran's military strategy, it doesn't really depend on an army or an air force or even much of a navy. It's proxies and missiles. And then the nuclear program would be something that moves it to a much more significant threat. But until that day comes, they have to focus on proxies and missiles. Both have now, with the exception of the Houthis, have been so, I don't want to overstate it, but to say that they're neutralized. But Iran's power projection is nowhere near where it was. And my hope is that this becomes the new normal for the region. And that you have this strong, I think the Abraham Accords, it originally, a lot of the work was around the UAE and other Gulf countries working with Israel to counter a common threat of Iran. And that work should continue. This is, I think, part of the burden sharing. If we can increase cooperation between Arabs and Israelis to counter extremism, to counter threats presented by the Iranian regime, that is a very good strategy for the United States to get behind. So I support continuing the work to stabilize the region by addressing Iran's proxy warfare in the gray zone, which they have been remarkably successful at. Those same proxies killed 603 Americans in Iraq alone. And so it has been at enormous cost to the United States. But I believe that and then the missiles, obviously in a much different place, taking out the missile production, the missile launchers, and the missiles themselves takes away another power projection capability that the regime has. So the Europeans, I think, are much more alive to the Iranian threat through the war in Ukraine. And I think the Europeans the E3 especially, are in a much better place in some ways because Iranian drones are flying in
Right.
Ukraine.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, I'm sorry, you only have about a minute before I turn to the next question.
Sure.
But please.
Well, I agree very much with what Mr. Hook had to say, but I'll just add, Iran remains motivated to try to rearm these proxies. It's going to be very difficult for them initially, but they will look for those openings. If there is chaos in Syria, they will try to find their way between the cracks. They will try to restore. It requires intense focus and day-to-day management by expert teams at the State Department and the Treasury Department in order to get to the right port operators, ships, front companies, banks, et cetera. Because once that revenue is going down, as it did during the first Trump administration, and it's come back up, and neither Biden nor Trump at second two has been able to bring it down yet, then you force the Iranian regime to make choices between whether they'll use that revenue, what they have at home, to deal with a very restive population, or if they'll continue to try to squander it on these foreign adventures.
Great. Thank you very much. Senator Scott and then Senator Rosen.
Okay. Well, first off, thanks.
I'm going to defer my time. So
You're very nice.
just to do that in our subcommittee and people make the time to come, so we have to be here till the end.
Well, first off, thanks both of you for hosting this. Thank you guys. Thank each of you for being here. President Trump is the most pro-Israel, pro-peace president of our lifetime and has made all the difference in the Middle East, which is why I'm glad we're having this important discussion, how we can protect American interests throughout the region as we continue to stand with our great friend and ally, Israel. Over the years, Israel and the Jewish people have faced countless obstacles in unimaginable persecution. If you look at what happened on October 7th, when Iran-backed Hamas terrorists brutally murdered and kidnapped Americans and Israelis. I think all of us have met with families. They're still being held hostage, and it's pretty heartbreaking. Every day these hostages are held is another reminder why we must continue to stand with our good friend Israel, our one true democratic ally in the Middle East. Mr. Hook, with this and your experience as your special representative for Iran in mind, how important is it that America stands with Israel in countering Iranian aggression?
I think it's indispensable. It's absolutely indispensable for us to, as I was saying earlier, there is a favorable balance of power now in the Middle East, and the Iranian regime is facing its worst crisis in its 45-year history. As Chairman McCormick was saying, the challenge now is how do we translate the military gains into political wins, into an enduring sort of greater peace? I think a lot of that comes through Saudi normalization and helping to bring an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict. You can do it through obviously working with the Palestinians. You know, Jared Kushner put out a very credible and good peace plan in the first term. That created, I think, an opening when the PA walked away from the table for the Emiratis to come to the table. And then we had our first Abraham Accord, and then Bahrain and Sudan and Morocco. I think that that should continue. And I think that it'll be very good for Israel. It'll be very good, I think, for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. At some point, I hope the political space exists for Saudi to do that. I think we've seen UAE and Bahrain and the other countries in the Abraham Accords have enjoyed great benefit from it. And I think more countries will follow.
Bottom line is we need to stand with Israel. Unfortunately, we know it's not just Iran that's the problem. We have terrorist groups like Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood fueled by our enemies. And countries like Qatar and Turkey claim to be an ally to the United States, but aligning with terrorist groups and against our true allies. So again, Mr. Hook, do you think the United States should be helping these countries that enable terror?
Right now, I saw today that it looks like Qatar had said to Hamas that they need to have a better response to the proposal that's on the table. And so it would be very good to have Qatar to continue to pressure Hamas so that we can bring an end to this war. I worked very closely with all of our Gulf partners and believe that the Gulf is the heart of the new Middle East. Where you see high levels of Iranian interference, there's a perfect correlation of misery and terrorism and poverty. And so I think the Gulf is the future of the Middle East. And as I said earlier, we need to work with our partners in the region and stand with them in good times and in bad.
So what do you think about Turkey? Well, first off, I look at Qatar that, they've supported Hamas all along. They've given money to Hamas. They have the Hamas leaders in their country. They live in luxury, and they don't put you can't see any pressure to bring these hostages home. It's disappointing. And in Turkey's, it doesn't seem like they're much better.
Turkey is always complicated. We had obviously our bilateral issues with them when I served in the first term. With the fall of Assad, obviously that was a win for Turkey to expand its influence, which could very much, come at cost for the Kurds. And so from everything I see, there's a lot of effort to try to work through these bilateral issues in the second term of the Trump administration.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you again for letting me go. Thanks, Jackie.
Senator Rosen.
Well, as protocol goes, we always defer to the chair of ranking member. So I have to be here till 4. So we appreciate that everyone comes to this important subcommittee, and happy to take my questions before we gavel. So Senator Shaheen, please.
Thank you very much, Senator Rosen and Chair McCormick. Thank you both for holding this hearing, and thank you to each of our witnesses for testifying. I think it's fair to say that there's general bipartisan agreement on this committee, and I think probably in Congress, that a stable Syria is in the best interests of the United States. So as you're thinking about what we should be doing in Syria, what are the resources that are needed to bring greater stability there, and what security guarantees are needed and that the United States could be helpful with? And I will throw it open to whoever would like to answer.
Syria also is at a pivotal moment, coming out of war, but with a very fragile government and society. And I think there are a number of steps that we should be taking now that Syria has met the criteria to lift sanctions on them. They're not perfect, but it's important that Syria succeed. The first is stability and mediation among various sectoral groups. The U.S. was very effective in solving sectoral disputes in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. I think that's one of the keys to their stability in the long term, working between the KDP and PUK. In Syria, we have an opportunity to help Syria become a united country as well. The next is a recovery strategy. There's been a tremendous amount of physical infrastructure destruction, social destruction, public services. 2.4 million children are out of school. A quarter of housing is damaged or destroyed. This will not be rebuilt on its own without financing, accountability, and a lot of coordination. So having a strong recovery strategy that looks broadly at infrastructure, social services, the economy, et cetera, is key. The third, I'll give four. The third is working on refugee return. What we've learned from studies globally is that the vast majority of refugees never return. And I think if we want to see something different in Syria with returns, something different will need to happen. And that will require enabling conditions in Syria so that refugees can return and find stability and education and jobs. And then finally, Al-Hol and Roj and the ISIS prisons are a remaining sore spot in the Northeast. Some 9,000 fighters are in prison, probably likely will be incarcerated for a long time, if not in perpetuity. But there are 40,000 family members, the women and children.
Right.
Many of the women are criminals also, but the children are not getting adequate education, and having growing up in that environment is a long-term risk to them as well as to future radicalization issues. So those are the four steps that I'd recommend.
I'm surprised you didn't mention lifting of sanctions. Did I miss that?
No, the sanctions lifting that happened last week, and then or a month ago or so, as well as other steps to do so.
But I think that there has been rhetoric about lifting the sanctions, but the actual implementation of that is ongoing. So how important do you think that is?
I think it's crucial. Syria is not going to recover without funds. They need to rebuild buildings, and that costs money, and that money has to go through banks. And in order to give Syria a chance at not devolving into chaos again, there needs to be funding flowing into it, but done in ways that manage accountability so that it's being spent as intended.
And how challenging is the continued bombing from Israel into Syria in terms of preventing the ability of the country to come together?
I think all of the violence, the intersectoral violence with neighboring countries, et cetera, is putting Syria in a very delicate spot. It could devolve back into civil war and stay that way for a long time, or it could weather it and go forward. And I think a lot of that depends on U.S. leadership and making sure that some of these conditions are in place, including internal stability, relations with neighbors, recovery, and helping the refugees return.
Thank you. Last week, the minority on this committee released this report on China, The Price of Retreat, and it addresses policies that have been put in place since the Trump administration came into office at the beginning of the year. And it talks about ceding ground to China. In the Middle East, we know that Huawei is developing 5G networks in Kuwait, Egypt, and that China has held its first ever joint military drills over Egyptian pyramids. It also serves as an intermediary for dual-use products used by Houthis for their drones. So what does China want in the Middle East? Again, Ambassador Shapiro.
Sure. Thank you, Senator. China clearly wants to establish influence, both economic, but increasingly also military footprint and relationships. And so it's one of the reasons ensuring that we remain the security partner of choice for our partners in the region is critical. When we've been negotiating over the last couple administrations the possibility of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, the Saudis have come to us and said, we'd like a security guarantee from the United States, which I think is reasonable to grant, but it must be coupled with clear limitations on Saudi-Chinese military cooperation. That I think would not just help us with the Saudis, but it would actually set a frame for others in the Gulf. And that should be critical. Now, we also have these other presence. We have a small presence in Iraq, small presence in Syria. Those support partners like the Kurds, obviously help continue the counter-ISIS mission. If we were to precipitously remove ourselves from all those areas, it would raise a lot of questions in the minds of various partners, and the Chinese would certainly be looking for opportunities to show, maybe not initially militarily, but economically or with cultural or other kinds of programming, that they are an alternative to us. That's something that is very dangerous for our interests.
Well, thank you. I recommend the report to each of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking.
Thank you. Senator Rosen, then Senator Daines.
Well, thank you. I want to think a little bit about the future. We know what's going on now. We know what we need to do, but I believe we have a big future with the Abraham Accords. And as one of the founders and co-chairs of the Bipartisan Senate Abraham Accords Caucus, I firmly believe the Abraham Accords is a vehicle for regional integration and transformation. Potential Abraham Accords countries, like we've talked about, Saudi Arabia, have made clear that future expansion of the Accords hinges in part on a durable day after plan. It's for Gaza, it ends in a two-state solution. Ambassador Shapiro, could you just expand on your testimony to discuss the value of increasing the number of Abraham Accords countries, whether they're in the region or outside the region? What countries do you think we could bring next into the fold? And the impact of the day after in Gaza and the West Bank by increasing regional integration and enhancing Israeli security?
Thank you, Senator. The Abraham Accords, I want to repeat, were one of the great achievements of the first Trump administration, really of modern Middle East history. They fortunately did not recede, but also sort of stalled during the war. Negotiations continued all through the war with the Saudis on a normalization agreement, and I believe they continue to this day in the second Trump administration. I don't think the Saudis are likely to come to that agreement until the war in Gaza is over. And they have said, the Crown Prince and other Saudi officials repeatedly, they would like to know that there is a pathway to a future Palestinian state. That can be defined lots of ways, but that should be part of this. But I do think their indications that as long as their public and other Arab publics are seeing the scenes of combat and hunger and deprivation out of Gaza, even though they put as much of the blame on Hamas as anybody does, it doesn't create the political context for them to move forward. But we shouldn't just focus on the Saudis. I mentioned the Negev Forum, which has sort of gotten lost in the story.
Negev Forum is amazing.
I used to chair I
restart
used to be the U.S. chair of the steering committee of the Negev Forum, which is the U.S., Israel, UAE, Morocco, Bahrain, and Egypt. And so as soon as possible, coming out of the war, we need to reconvene that group and show that this is a multilateral organization that can drive the benefits of regional integration and normalization to their citizens with the working groups on water, on health, on education, on tourism, and the like. But it needs to be expanded. Jordan, we were right on the verge of bringing them in before October 7th. They should be brought in. There should be a role for the Palestinians, not maybe as a full member, but the Palestinian Authority should be present. But I wouldn't stop there. Mauritania, Indonesia, some other smaller Arab League members in Africa have expressed interest previously in joining the Negev Forum and building out that sense of a community of U.S. partners, Israeli and Arab, all working together on those regional problems, but also in the context of a day after plan, some of those countries coming to Gaza to fund reconstruction, others coming as the troops of an Arab-led or U.S. partnered security force to provide the security in that interim phase. That's a real opportunity.
Yeah, as been to the Abraham Accords countries multiple times and multiple trips to the region. Everyone discussed the possibilities and the all the things that we could do based on the Negev Forum in so many of those areas: water, energy, transportation, cybersecurity, education, and well, even tourism, right? And so I really look forward to that. I have just a minute left. I'm going to just ask you, Ambassador Shapiro, about the U.S.-Israel Memo of Understanding. You highlighted in your testimony the current 10-year MOU between the U.S. and Israel, key part of our bilateral relationship. The current MOU underscores our long-term security commitment to Israel, facilitates robust military-to-military cooperation, and provides Israel with the platforms and systems it needs to maintain its qualitative military edge. The MOU expires in 2028. So can you talk about how the MOU and re-upping it or modifying it, whatever we need to renegotiate that, it will advance our mutual security interests?
Sure. Thank you, Senator. It obviously remains a U.S. interest that Israel be able to defend itself. We've seen the kinds of threats they've faced from multiple fronts. And as an ally that brings major capability to deter and defeat common adversaries, this obviously serves American interests as well. Now, it is important to start that process now so that if an agreement can be reached, let's say a year from now, that's 2 years before the expiration of the current MOU, that means you don't have a gap in the acquisitions necessary. But there needs to be a full analysis done as part of that negotiation of the threats really of the next 2 decades, because that's when this MOU, what it produces, will actually bear its fruit. We didn't, when we negotiated the one from 2016, fully anticipate the drone threat that has emerged. Clearly, a major part of this is going to need to be refurbishing and replenishing and upgrading Israel's already excellent missile and air and missile defense, Arrow and David Sling and Iron Dome, and now Iron Beam. But we see the proliferation of those threats, so that's going to need to be rethought. And there are opportunities to think about how Israel, as now a partner to a number of these other Arab states that it has normalized relations with, and we hope there will be more of that, under the umbrella of CENTCOM's convening ability, can actually maximize, get more bang for its buck as the leading partner, but together with others that they are interoperable with, that they train with, that they share radar and other data with. That's something that could also be countenanced and embedded within the MOU discussions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Daines.
Thanks, Chair McCormick. A few weeks ago, I made a swing through the Caucasus. This is a question for Ambassador Shapiro. I had the privilege to meet with President Aliyev. We had a very productive conversation. I think one of the undertold stories of what's happening certainly in that region of the world is what they've done to support Israel in terms of energy resources. I also had a chance to meet with the Israeli ambassador to Azerbaijan, Ambassador George Deek. It was a unique opportunity to explore the long-standing diplomatic ties between Azerbaijan and Israel, a relationship that only looks to grow stronger with the announcement of the SOCAR oil deal, which I think is going to help diversify the Israeli energy opportunities. Ambassador Shapiro, do you believe that Azerbaijan's relationship with Israel, which I think is an undertold story, might stand as an opportunity for other Islamic nations to expand diplomatic ties and work to normalize relations?
Thank you, Senator. I do. I think this relationship, as you said, is sort of underappreciated. Sometimes people would say, how can we expand the Abraham Accords? Maybe Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan has had diplomatic relations with Israel for many years, but it's one of the leading Muslim countries that has done that long before the Abraham Accords came on the scene. And because of their proximity to the region and even to the threats Israel faces from Iran, they've been a security partner because of their energy resources. They're an energy partner because of their Muslim population. They have
and I might add with that is it's the only country in the world that borders Russia and Iran.
So
very strategic.
Their strategic importance is really impossible to deny, but they also have that sort of cultural convening capability and able to build bridges to strengthen Israel's relations with other Arab and Muslim countries, including some in South Asia or Central Asia, which already have relations, but not as deep and as rich as Azerbaijan's. But as we've thought about ways of broadening those regional convenings to really have the sense of an European Union or an ASEAN style organization or gathering of countries in the Middle East, Azerbaijan most certainly should take part in something.
I think Brzezinski described Central Asia as the wine bottle and Azerbaijan as the cork. As the wine bottle and Azerbaijan as the cork becomes a very important part of that east-west type corridor that you want to see happen here with Central Asia embracing, moving more in this direction when you think about who they're surrounded by and their neighbors to the north and to the east. Mr. Shapiro, in your testimony, you also laid out several things that have changed over the last 7 to 10 years regarding Iran's nuclear production and weapons delivery capabilities. I'd argue that Iran's intent is and has always been regarding the nuclear capabilities to create a nuclear weapon. If they were trying to create peaceful nuclear operations, why are they doing it way underground? Nuclear operations, why are they doing it way underground? Why it took the B-2s to destroy that versus something on the surface. So I think we've settled that question. I think under the Obama administration, we had a big fight up here on Capitol Hill. What's Iran's intent? And I think we've been vindicated in terms of it was to build a nuclear warhead. Looking at their current capabilities, behavior, and rhetoric,
Do you believe the U.S. should be concerned about their space program? Just in the last 24 hours, there have been news reports about the Iranians launching a rocket here for their satellite program. They're saying it's for peaceful purposes. As somebody who's from a state that's a third of our ICBMs, I think differently perhaps around the importance of space is to deliver an ICBM. Do you think their space program is a means for perfecting an intercontinental weapons system?
Senator, I'm not expert in the technology, but I do understand that there's not a huge difference between a space launch vehicle and an ICBM. And if you're able to master one technology, it's quite applicable to the other. What we clearly know about Iran, and of course we knew this in 2015 when the JCPOA was signed, and we knew it in 2018 when the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA, is that Iran has unbridled hostility. They express it openly. It's their ideology. It's the kind of organizing principle of the regime toward Israel, which they've called for its destruction, toward the United States. They have, of course, pursued a nuclear weapons program. We understand that, but also a ballistic missile program. And we even saw the danger that program in its current state can cause in the destruction that Israel
Yeah,
endured.
which I think is part of the undertold story as well. Israel having to take preemptive action here was around those ballistic missiles, even absence of a nuclear war.
And they were on a path,
overwhelm the systems, the defense of Israel.
exactly. They were on a path to produce 3,000 a
Sure.
year. Really couldn't have been
Yeah.
sustained.
M-
And so it's same risk with an ICBM.
Thank you. Mr. Hook, I want to give you a chance to maybe to weigh in on this as well.
Yeah, the Iranian regime has been using its space program as a cover for its ICBM program for 10, 15 years or longer. And so I remember when I was working on the UN Security Council, passing resolutions condemning Iran's use of its space program for these purposes, to develop an ICBM capability so they can threaten the United States.
Thank you. I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
There's a lot more to talk about here. So
There
but
sure
thank you.
is. Senator Van Hollen, you made it just under the wire. You are our last set of questions for this expert panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Rosen. And to all of you, thank you for your testimony today. Ambassador Shapiro, it's good to see you. I think as you've indicated in your testimony, it's very important at some point to convert military gains into sustainable political strategic gains. And that's also is true with respect to the changes in Syria. And I want to get to that in a moment. First, I do want to focus on Gaza because President Trump came to office saying on day one he was going to end the war and get the hostages released. And here we are many months later, and we're not there yet. And in fact, more civilians are starving to death in Gaza today than at any point previously during this war. And you testified with respect to this entity that's been established, the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, clearly not working, clearly broken. I'm just looking at the headline, the UN chief slams US-backed Gaza aid operation, quote, "It is killing people." Mr. Chairman, I'd like to include in the record a very short statement from the World Food Program about an incident just the other day where they were trying to deliver food into Gaza.
So included.
People got killed. And just in today's Haaretz newspaper, they say that this centers have become death traps. Every day, dozens of people are killed, usually by Israeli soldiers who try to control the mobs with live fire. To date, more than 1,000 Palestinians have been killed at distribution centers en route to them or near trucks carrying food. Ambassador Shapiro, I saw your testimony. I agree with your point that we need to replace this with a system where we kind of flood the zone with food. Could you just elaborate on your idea?
Thank you, Senator. So the problem the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is trying to solve is a real problem. That is Hamas hijacking food for its use and to use as a method of political control. I think Hamas bears the lion's share of blame for the hunger that many Palestinians are experiencing. But the way the foundation is designed, it's in very limited locations. It requires Palestinian civilians to transit long distances over land and near Israeli military positions. And as you said, it's caused numerous incidents where people have been killed, probably sometimes by Hamas, but sometimes by Israel's own admission, by Israeli fire as well. So it's not working. It can be part of a broader solution. The flood the zone strategy could include more distribution points for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. One of the problems is those distances people have to travel, and they're only really clustered in the south with one central location. But if they were across the full territory of the Gaza Strip, and it was accompanied by an additional zone flooding by other resources, what it does is it reduces by market value the monetary value of that aid, and it reduces Hamas's ability to use it for political control, as well as making more aid available to people. It's not going to completely solve the problem because Hamas will always take its cut. And that is a legitimate problem that the Israelis have highlighted. But the way this is structured, it's just too dangerous, and it isn't working the way to solve the problem the way it needs to be solved.
Yeah, look, nobody wants to see any food aid diverted to Hamas for its gains. There's no clear information that somehow this food is not also getting to Hamas. And I would just refer you and others to the statements of our former Ambassador Satterfield and Cindy McCain, who said that there's been in the old system, there was no systematic diversion to Hamas. They found no evidence of it, despite asking the Israeli government for proof many times over. Quickly turning to Syria, I was glad to see the Trump administration lift the embargo, the blanket sanctions, but I did argue that we should put in place immediately snapback provisions tied to making sure they hit standards, including protecting minority populations. We've seen these awful killings in the South and other parts of the country, Alawites, Druze, Christians, and others. So do you think that the Trump administration should do a better job of being clear as to what activities will cause the sanctions to go back into place?
Senator, I do. I think the gamble, it is a gamble to lift sanctions as quickly and as fulsomely as President Trump announced in Saudi Arabia. But I think it's the right gamble to give this transitional government a chance to find its footing. But it has to be held accountable in all the ways you described, how it treats minority populations, inclusive governance, obviously corruption, and things of the like. And when we see what happened recently with massacres of the Druze population, and maybe earlier there were some in the Alawite areas, that needs to be properly flagged as something that if it continues, there has to be maybe some off-ramp or some trajectory that will not lead to the full lifting of sanctions. Of course, Congress will have its say, and you might be able to build in some off-ramps or some rather snapback provisions on those congressionally instituted sanctions that you'll have to legislate to remove. So you may have an opportunity there. It also, when we see that kind of brutality against one civilian population or one minority population, it raises doubts about for all of them. And in particular, the Kurds who manage the counter-ISIS efforts and the detention facilities in northeast Syria and are to help sustain them, their willingness to take that next step toward peaceful integration into Syrian national institutions will clearly be up for grabs and maybe not be able to happen if the Syrian central government is not living up to those commitments. So I do think it should be very clear what our expectations are, and there should be some conditionality for the full implementation of the lifting of sanctions.
Thank you, and I appreciate your bringing up the Syrian Kurds who have been our allies in the fight against ISIS, and we need to keep our commitments to them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you to our star guest. I'm going to step away and give the gavel here to the ranking member. I want to thank you for your participation. She has a couple more questions. We're grateful for you to be here. I think a very good discussion. Thanks to the committee staff for making it happen too. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've had such great participation today. So we slated for an hour, and I just have two more things I want to ask, so I figure I will stay and close out the hearing. So if you indulge me, I just want to actually this is just a statement for the record. I agree with the panel and my fellow senators that we have to have strong diplomatic engagement. It's more pressing now with Iran in order to build upon the military success we've had to ensure Iran never develops or acquires a nuclear weapon. And of course, as Senator Daines talked about, we have to watch what they're doing in space, because we know space is an integral warfighting domain. Well, real space and cyberspace, but those are that's for another hearing. I want to ask two things. One is they're both to Ms. Culbertson. One is about the Iraq reintegration program, and the other is about Gaza reconstruction. So I recently returned from a trip to Iraq. I was in Erbil and Baghdad. I was struck by the complex integration challenges that's facing the state. A large number of internally displaced persons still residing in the Kurdish parts of the country, also tens of thousands of repatriated individuals from the Syrian camps. So, Ms. Culbertson, after you followed Iraq through your career, you're an expert in migration and refugees. Can you talk about the importance of thoughtful reintegration of these populations and how we can use that thoughtful reintegration so extremist groups don't take advantage of these populations if they're not provided life-saving care?
Iraq still has about 1 million internally displaced people, along with hosting a lot of Syrian refugees. What we've found in a number of our studies is that it's very difficult for host countries in the Middle East to absorb the refugee populations that they have. And some of that is based on policy. So a couple of the policies are not allowing refugees to fully participate in labor markets. There's not enough aid to go around, so not being able to work and have jobs then puts these people in a bind and leads to a lot of poverty. The Kurdistan region of Iraq is one of the few places that actually allows the refugees and the IDPs to work, but its economy is pretty constrained, and they have not been able to do so as much. So for refugees to integrate into the Kurdistan region of Iraq, the issue there is largely economic rather than policy. To help Syrian refugees return, as mentioned, in our studies, when we've looked at global refugee situations, the vast majority of refugees don't return. On average, 10 years after the end of a conflict, only about 30% of refugees have returned. And so a lot of this is because the conditions in the source country are not sufficient for them to voluntarily want to go back. And those are some of the conditions that we've talked about here, which are needing to have stability and not being afraid of violence upon return. In Syria, about a quarter of housing was destroyed, and then among abandoned housing, squatters moved in. So if refugees want to return, there's no place for them to live. The schools are not sufficient to absorb large numbers of people. The labor market can't either. So the United Nations is anticipating 1 million or 2 returnees over the next year. I think this number would be very hard to attain without having additional activities to make Syria stable and a place where refugees can go and stay and see that they will have a stable, safe life.
Thank you. And actually, I'm going to ask everyone really quickly for this is my last question, because we all know that we need to see the release of the hostages. We all know that we need to have humanitarian aid come in and help the people in Gaza. And we all hope for the day after. So if you would just briefly, each one, tell me what you think the most important thing is that we can do to begin that process, what you might recommend. And I will just finish out the hearing with that, because I think that's the most pressing topic on the minds of so many right now. Ms. Culbertson, we'll start with you.
Sure. There are a lot of needs for the Gaza day after. The first one that always comes up is security. I'll let my co-panelists speak to that. A huge issue is the level of destruction and where Gazans can live. Assuming the vast majority of Gazans stay in Gaza, which is, I think, fairly well agreed upon. 70% of housing is damaged or destroyed. And we did a study on how can Gazans stay in Gaza and where can they live. And what we found is that a couple things. First, that the damage is not it's not universal. There are neighborhoods that can be rehabilitated. And so investing in those in a method we're calling incremental urbanism. Second is developing a new type of camp. What we've also found is that once our camps are set up, they tend to last forever in perpetuity and in the initial ways that the street and block structure that they were set up. So develop better camps. It will be years before Gaza can be fully reconstructed. And so the camps set up now will be long-term homes for some people. So make them better. And then third is allowing, raising and reconstruction and development of new neighborhoods. And there is open land in Gaza. So I think a key recommendation is once the security and Hamas questions are settled, come up with a Gaza-wide plan for where and how people can live. And we think that there are evidence-based ways of providing for those.
Thank you. Quickly, Ambassador.
Senator, on the security issue, once there's a ceasefire and once we have a declared end to the war, there is going to be a gap before you can have a fully empowered Palestinian Authority affiliated peace security force, and that should be filled by an Arab force, or maybe other countries besides just the UAE, Egypt, Morocco, maybe Indonesia. I think has shown interest in participating. And CENTCOM has a plan for what an interim security mission for Gaza could look like. Troops from those countries supported by the United States without boots on the ground in Gaza, but from Egypt or elsewhere in the region to provide some of our unique capabilities and support functions. And let that be sort of the bridge until you get the U.S. trained from U.S. Office of Security Cooperation, Palestinian Security Forces ready to come in and play that role. But all of those countries have said to us, we're not going to come in to fight Hamas. So Hamas needs to actually be removed. And Israel has done a great deal of damage to it militarily, but the remnants are going to have to be sent out. And so one of the sort of end game negotiations needs to be the exile of the remaining commanders and at least a critical mass of some of the fighters. And we have a model for this. In 1982, 14,000 PLO cadres were evacuated from Beirut. It was a U.S.-led diplomatic initiative. They were sent to locations around the region. It's not going to be those numbers. It would be considerably less than that. And so this can be done, but it's going to need to be done to get the participation of those Arab countries to come in and play that interim security role.
Thank you. Mr. Hook, last comments?
The only thing more complicated than the day after is how we get to the day after.
Yeah.
And I think we still have a tough period ahead. If Hamas were to lay down its arms, there would be peace. But they don't want to, and they want to continue. There aren't many examples in the history of warfare where a combatant, as part of its war strategy, uses its own people as a human sacrifice. And this war has been a calamity for the civilians in Gaza, and the suffering is immense. And if Hamas were to put down its weapons, we could be in a much different place. But they have the hostages as their leverage, and they use the hostages, the Israeli hostages, no differently than they use their own people. And so I hope that all of this diplomatic effort with many parties is going to lead to a ceasefire, which can then lead to something more enduring. I like a number of the ideas that have been proposed here. It's going to be a lot of work to even get to that point, and then the day after is in some ways itself complicated.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here. I do like that Ms. Culbertson, I'm going to probably steal this from you, but helping around the world, whether it's defense, diplomacy, or development, it's not charity, it's strategy. I think the three of you have shown in your strategic thinking, research, analysis, and careers how important that all is. So the closing business, the hearing record will remain open until the close of business tomorrow, July 24th. We would ask the witnesses to respond to any questions submitted for the record as quickly as possible with your response, and it will be included in the record. And I thank you again for joining us, and your work, and the subcommittee is now adjourned. you.